Okay, this week we're meeting with a very special guest. He's someone that's come up in a number of our podcasts already, particularly anyone who's spent time around Mills College. His name is Les Stuck. He is a coworker with me at cycling. He's helped out a lot with educational tools and videos about working with Macs and stuff like that. He also works at Mills. And where he's come up in the past is that he's actually introduced a lot of people to new ways about thinking about how to do their art. And it makes a lot of sense because if you look into Les's background, he is truly a multidisciplinary. He is the multimedia guy. He works in music and sound. He does a lot of visual work. He works with a lot of different kinds of performers and really does a lot of interesting work in a lot of different disciplines. So, hi Les, how are you doing?
Hey, Darwin. I'm doing pretty well.
Thanks.
Here in Oakland.
I'm sorry?
I said summer's here in Oakland.
Oh, good for you. I'm up in the mountains here in the Rocky Mountains, and just today, our last bit of snow disappeared, but we're also in the middle of this thing where we've had like hail 4 days in a row. So I don't know what that bodes for the summer, but it doesn't seem very good.
No.
So I'd like to start off by having you talk a little bit about your background. I kind of gave the quick explanation of what you do, but I think it'd be really interesting for someone who is able to sort of like interact with a lot of different media. I think it'd be really interesting to hear a little bit about your background.
Well, I started out as a musician, and then like playing blues harmonica and electric bass and whatever, and just began being attracted to technology, and sort of quickly became a recording engineer. Moved to San Francisco and started working at Hyde Street Studios, recording a bunch of punk bands in the 80s. And I kind of, even back then, I kind of developed a taste for really unusual music, weird ways of making music, and also trying not to be a slave to the technology or trying to think of, making technology work for the art, whatever, or the quote art, unquote. So then I started, I got a gig with the San Francisco Ballet, doing like hardware sampler and 24-track analog music for dance for this composer from Europe, Tom Mullins. And he was doing a piece for William Forsythe, and that kind of got me on their coattails, and suddenly I found myself in Frankfurt, Germany, doing theater sound, essentially, and some studio work for ballet. Became a sound engineer with the Ensemble Modern in Frankfurt. Got acquainted with Max, and started making little algorithmic compositions. And just the fact that I was hanging out with this dance company and living with one of their dancers and doing their sound and stuff, I started naturally getting involved in making music for dance, and it all made sort of sense. So I just really got into that sort of thing. I started learning Max. I bought it from Opcode, and somebody taught me how to crack it. I could crack any copy of any Opcode product.
Okay. And
it was a really scary crack, because it wasn't, let's do this in this sandbox and I'll send it off to all my friends, spelled with a Z, but it was like where you had to actually go into the computer and write on a particular spot on the disk in hex and hope that you didn't completely destroy everything, So I was doing a gig for a piece by Kaya Sariaho for the Ensemble Modern, and Risto Nieminen, who's artistic director for IRCAM, happened to attend and invited me to come visit. So they just let me play around in the pedagogy department for a week. And I said, hey, your guys' version of Max is kind of out of date. I'll install the latest version on all your computers if you want. And after I did that, they offered me a job. So I don't know. That's how I got in there. But the interesting thing about working for Earcom is all of a sudden they were running this audio version of Max, which eventually became MSP or something like that. And so I found that I was able to use my sound engineering skills in this new version of Max, and also, so when Cycling 74 came into existence with this Audio Max software, I was one of the few people who was out of a job who knew how to do this stuff. So
right,
I got hired. The whole time I've been working with all kinds of different technology, a lot of different types of recording devices and samplers and so forth. And there have been times where I tried to build a complete, Max universe that would make every sound that I could imagine. Those things go on for a few years and then they crash horribly or something. But I did do a bunch of algorithmic stuff where you would make this sort of total polyrhythmy where there's no way to count bars or anything, but it just keeps moving forward. And that became really useful for dancers because no matter how you count their music, they're going to count it differently. So
right.
just let them, don't even worry about how it counts out. And then at Earcom, I learned a lot about spatialization and ring modulators and, score following. It was a great learning experience. Then finally, I got this job as a technical director at Mills College, and that's where I began doing a lot of teaching. And most of my teaching has been a one-to-one, like individual instruction or private lessons or something.
Mm-hmm.
So you go through a bunch of students, and some are just super beginners, and they want to be, given a good start and clear. Other people have very particular projects, and they're focused, and they just want you to help them out. But once in a while, you'll encounter someone who's just got the bug, and they want to do something awesome. They don't know what it's going to be, but they're just like eating everything up. And I think you mentioned about some people I've sort of launched or got going in Max. I don't think it's that. I think I just mostly just found some good people and gave them a good kick, basically. Because I'm thinking of people like Jeff Lubo, Elise Baldwin, Ben Bracken, Patrice Scanlon, Taryn Barra, Matthew Carter, probably a lot more, and people who are just doing really cool things with Max, and then they just needed to be shown a lot more interesting worlds and maybe ways of making the whole thing more manageable. And then they went off and did amazing things.
So when you're working with someone like that, someone that you feel already kind of has their arms conceptually around things, and you're going to kind of push them a little further out of the nest, what is there like some general concepts that you often run into, or is it super individualistic?
I'd say the one thing that you see over and over again is this way of working with Max where you kind of patch a bunch of stuff together and cover it with duct tape, and you can kind of get it to work, but it can't work reliably. And so that's one thing that I try to convince people to, do really good tools for storing and recalling and controlling things during the course of experience. So, I guess memory and storage, clean signal paths, and just good audio principles.
Right.
There's this weird thing about a lot of computer music is they kind of forget the fact that it's just audio, and you just have to. So you have to think of keeping the sound clean and having a good mix and so forth. And the other thing is a lot of times when people are going really gung-ho on Max, or probably any art software, there's a tendency to go down a rabbit hole, or to be so enchanted by the beauty of software that you forget that your piece sort of doesn't sound good.
Right.
So I try to get people to sit back and just listen to it like they didn't know how it was being made. Or people are starting a new project. I say, well, the first thing to do is just to go for a walk and just think about what you actually want to do, And so, yeah, a lot of times when I go to a concert, I try to forget how the music is being made, how many different LAN networks are communicating with each other, and just listen and look and try to appreciate it for what it is.
Well, I think that's a really interesting conceptual base, because I think you see this in a lot of different kinds of art form. In the music world, guitarists sometimes get so focused on what guitar pedals they have that they forget they're supposed to be playing. Or, my passion, which is the modular synth, is horrible about that. You can get so wrapped up in the joy of patching that you forget that you bought the thing initially to make some music, right?
It's a real common problem.
I think it is. And I can see where Max could engender the same kind of thing, especially in, I don't know, how often do you run into this thing where people really are, their vision for how they're going to use Max is sort of like to invent their own grand unifying theory of the universe?
Well, that's one of the addictive aspects of computer programming in general, I think, is once you forget about the fact that it's just a machine that's blinking lights, you start seeing these perfectly constructed class structures and systems, and you can create a perfect world, unlike every other part of your life.
Yeah, everything else is sloppy, right?
Yeah. But of course, it has problems too, and you keep crashing kind of new versions, and so it's never finished, but it's always just beyond your grasp.
Okay, so as an outsider, you can see that, but do you still get emotional when machines crash or programs misbehave or whatever? Or do you feel like you have like the Zen grasp of avoiding that?
Well, I mean, there's some things like when you're getting close to a performance and your patch crashes, it's just like stop everything and figure out why it crashed,
Mm-hmm.
You have to chase those things down, and you have to have backups and all that other stuff. I think, and if you do that carefully, if you have enough experience and try to bash things around, then you can have some pretty major crashes, and you'll know how to get out of it.
Right.
A lot of times I tell students, well, see how long it takes you to reboot your computer and launch your patch again. And so it's like 90 seconds? Okay, well then if you crash in concert, you're just going to have to wait 90 seconds. And that gives people a lot of calm.
Right.
Like they know what they're going to deal with. The thing that gets really, I think the emotions only come up when it's something that just doesn't make any sense, or some bizarre little arcane rule that you just had to learn after 3 hours of wasting your time.
Right. Well, I have to admit, and this is sort of like one of those things I would never normally admit, but I sometimes end up just raging a little bit, right? And it's because there are times it seems as if computers and software systems actually have some kind of knowledge about how much stress you're under. And so it's inevitable that, and maybe it's just kind of being able to cope. If I'm not under a lot of stress and it crashes, I guess I feel like, well, okay, I can, use sort of like the methods I have at hand to be able to resolve the problem and fix it. But when it's like getting really close to a performance and it starts crashing and it never crashed that way, and this machine hates me and it's unfair, and
yes, that's all true.
Yeah, it seems that way anyway.
Well, just from doing so much live sound, I think, or studio work where there's just this tremendous economic pressure or whatever, I've just found that I may be freaking out inside, but that's not going to help me at all.
Right.
And the only thing that's going to help me out is just to be super calm and try to be objective. And that film expression, "Kill your babies." Sometimes you just have to let go of your big, wonderful idea and do it however it works.
Yeah, yeah. That's something that I try and impart on students, is that putting yourself in the position. I really like this idea of, shut down the computer, bring it back up, understand what that potential part of a performance is, because it seems like a lot of preparing for sort of like calmness in performance is to sort of have experienced everything you're liable to experience. And you hope, right? And if you're thoughtful about it, you can at least you can experience a large number of the things that you're likely to experience anyway. But that's really, that's kind of an interesting thing, because I think it's also something that everybody, or especially people who don't have a lot of background in doing live work, the assumption is, I'm going to plan for the very best experience that could happen. And I think if you prepare yourself also, have contingency plans and prepare yourself for the many less than optimal ways things could work, that there's some real value in that. If nothing else, to make yourself, as you suggested, feel like if something happened, you kind of know what the timing of having to cope with it might be.
Yeah. And have, know that you have various forms of backups and so forth.
Yeah, so now you mentioned working with, first of all, you mentioned doing recordings of punk bands and stuff. It's interesting. I didn't know that about you, and it's actually a background that we share, because some of my earliest work was when I was down in Texas, and I was sort of like one of the recording engineers for the Texas punks, which there was a bit of a movement down there, and it was a real fun time. Although what you talked about as economic pressures were very real in that scenario, because most of these people had next to zero money. And so you did have to really operate quickly, but you also had to sort of honor the genre.
Oh, that almost rhymes.
Yeah, it does. But, because there was, certainly in the Texas punk scene, there was a very specific sound that people were after. And if you could kind of capture that, it represented, it represented what they wanted to hear themselves be. Yeah.
I mean, at that particular point in time, I was mostly an assistant engineer.
Okay.
Working with other people. The beauty of some of the punk movement was kind of this rejection of refinement. But of course, it became codified as well.
Yeah, of course.
But I guess in terms of my, I really enjoy the music and began to understand the idea of translating from a really great live performance onto a studio track. Things like, for God's sake, get the first take down,
Right.
Always try to do that. And the particular studio that I worked at, Hyde Street, one of the owners, Dan Alexander, is this incredible equipment dealer. He would find all these amazing old tube mics and Class A consoles, and we'd be doing a project, and he'd say, "Oh, well, we're taking out this rack unit and giving you this rack unit," and you'd have to, or there'd be some beautiful old Neve, but you couldn't get the automation to work, and so we're constantly dealing with things breaking down and having to work around them. I think that was a really useful training.
Sure.
Anyway.
Now, you said that you were doing live sound too?
Yeah, not a huge amount of rock and roll, but sort of all kinds of different bands. Like the ensemble we're down is say, new music ensemble. type stuff with the Frankfurt Ballet.
I see. Sure.
Some
Okay. So
random dance.
that kind of meshed with your move into the dance world. Then you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, when I started working in the studio, I just wanted to do the weird stuff, and whoever would come in with some strange project, I wanted to get on that.
Right.
So the ballet, actually, this really weird thing happened to me in my life. In the mid '80s, I was living in San Francisco, working at Hyde Street, doing a lot of rock and punk and whatever. And in the evening, I would take a ballet class for whatever reason. In the morning, when I would wake up and my mind was still fresh, I would study post-structuralist theory, postmodern art, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So there were like these three worlds that had nothing to do with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I got this gig with the San Francisco Ballet to record this music for Tom Willems and Willems Forsythe, suddenly I was doing postmodern art with the ballet company in the studio, and they all came together. And then I fell in love with my future mom of my daughter, mm-hmm. Elizabeth Corbett, and just moved to Europe, and that kind of changed my life.
Wow, that's amazing.
And on the top of the Paris Opera, on the roof, I found a flipper graffiti. So I was actually made an honorary member of Flipper. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but that was my one claim to fame.
You were an honorary member?
Yeah. Well, when they were going to record, remember a Sex Bomb?
Yeah.
When they came in the studio to record that, the bass player forgot to bring his bass, so they used my bass. Here's Silvertone that was baby blue and had Bambi stickers all over it.
Nice. Well, that's
relates
something
to Max, right?
Well, I just need that stuff in my head because it helps me understand. It helps me embrace all the different places that we come from, right? And all the different internalized tattoos that we all wear.
Or aka scars, yeah.
So it's interesting to hear kind of how your interest both coalesced into, move into the next stage, but how also it sounds like it was a flyer, somewhat based in, meeting this woman, some of it based in your own interests. And I imagine the opportunity to just go and work in Europe just seemed like a pretty awesome opportunity anyway.
Yeah, that was amazing to be able to actually make art and be paid for it.
Yeah, indeed. And so you went to Frankfurt, and it sounds like that was kind of where what would become the future Les kind of always incubated, because you sort of took the knowledge you got from the recording studio, but also the knowledge from some of these other areas that you were studying. And it sounds like that's where they started to come together for you. Yeah,
it's always in the back of my mind. I thought of myself as a musician, and I wanted to write music, but everything I'd made was really bad. I made all this bad music, and it was just like, oh, God. And when I finally started using drum machines and samplers and studio technology to make rhythmic music for dance, suddenly people started liking my music. Plus, I was in this environment where the artistic standards are really high and kind of cutting edge and cool. So it was just this amazing. It was just a complete flowering.
So, do you think that they liked your music because it sounded different than what musicians were typically making, or was it because they were a little entranced by the technology, or was it that somehow working with the machines activated a different voice for you?
Yeah. How did that aesthetic emerge? I think it's a number of different things. So I never really caught the synthesizer bug. I don't usually use any kind of synthesized sound. I always use recorded sounds. That's part of just having worked in the studio all this time.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always had some sort of sense for interesting rhythms. I think at that time, a lot of the electronic music was, there's so much freedom in experimental music that a lot of times people make music that's quite wonderful, but you couldn't possibly use it for a dance.
Right.
So for some reason, I just had this immediate feedback. Like I would make something and there would be people dancing to it or not. And I would just learn very quickly and developed a particular style that was sort of semi-acoustic and multiple genres mixed together. And that became me. I just had the good fortune of getting some great gigs right at the beginning, and all of a sudden I was a dance music composer.
Right. Well, did you when you say that you had this immediate feedback, did you have like a bunch of equipment there and some dancers and you would try things out, or did you record a bunch of things and?
Yeah, the usual pattern is to make like a little sample and see what they think.
I see. Okay.
Well, because early on I tried to talk to a choreographer about music,
mm-hmm.
and just realized they had no idea what I was talking about. Well, I'd say something like, well, what if we did this with eighth notes? And they'd be like, I don't know, it should be faster, I don't know. And so I learned, okay, we're speaking two very different languages. They both happen at the same time. But the best way for me to communicate to you is just to give you music and tell you to listen to it.
Right.
And then also I began to learn how if you make a piece of music that's expressing a really clear mood or emotion or something, it's only going to be useful for a limited number of things. So it's more interesting if you can make something that's ambiguous in terms of what it's evoking.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
And, there's one thing I tell a lot of people when they want to do music for dance to keep in mind is a choreographer at this point in time has access to all the world's music.
Right.
They could use anything from any part of the world, any period of time, the best performers, edit it how they want, and half the time they don't even pay any rights for it.
Mm-hmm.
So you're competing against the world, which is working for free, and what can you, as a single composer, offer? I think the main thing you can offer is to make something unique and to try to find some sort of unique connection with the choreographer's vision.
I work with dancers occasionally and choreographers, and one of the things I notice about them is they have a tendency to embrace two kinds of music. On one hand, they tend to like things that are very emotional. So I hear a lot of selection of things with soaring violin solos or whatever.
Parrot.
Right. Or they go with the completely idiosyncratic, sort of like a bad day in Tom Waits' life, right? kind of thing. And there's something about either this highly emotional or highly quirky, and particularly if the rhythms kind of have a quirky lope to them or whatever. There tends to be a really an interest in these kind of particular mechanisms. And that's at least been my experience. Do you feel like there's some commonalities in the things that you see?
Well, certainly that emotional thing is always a strong draw. Because it's just one more element to make your big piece powerful.
Right.
And if you can have really powerful emotional music, that's great. And then if you have music that's kind of more confusing or quirky, that just makes whatever you do on stage more interesting. Because it's a tricky thing watching people dance for a half hour. What do you actually watch? What do you remember? And the music really provides a framework for for understanding the whole piece usually. So you're also dealing with what dancers have experienced that works for them.
Right. You're having to deal with that whole boatload of stuff as well, right? So one of the things I feel in having worked with dancers and from talking with other people, one of the words you just used has always been really important. This idea of powerful statements. It seems to me that is a common and very important thing in sort of the dance world. But there's this kind of flip side, which a lot of people who've tried working with dancers and haven't done well, when I talk to them, having worked with dancers, although I generally do visuals and not music, having worked with them, I realize that these composers, when they're talking, have an overly inflated sense of how important their part was in the performance, right?
Oh yeah, that's the first wall to climb over, is your own ego. Yeah, because I mean, people make art a lot of times because they can do their very personal vision. They don't have to explain it to anybody. They can do it just the way they want. And particularly in arts like maybe painting and music, you can just really go into your cave and create some amazing castle of your own invention and just that no one else can understand, but you think is perfect. With things like theater and dance, or let's say film, people are used to working a group of people, and so there's generally a director and a bunch of other artists who have to work towards the director's vision. And I think that's what you have to realize, is that you think it's a collaboration between music and dance, but actually usually it's the choreographer who got the gig. They have the artistic power, really, and you have to fit into their vision. Now, the way to get around that is to work really fast and come up with a lot of interesting ideas that just leapfrog them and say, wait a minute, why don't you just do this crazy thing? And suddenly, if you can do that sort of thing, you can kind of exert some influence on the final piece. But if you always wait around for what do you want, and then you try to give them what they're asking for, it makes the whole thing a lot slower.
Well, especially now that their option is either to sit there and listen to you fail repeatedly, or get on iTunes and choose any one of the 50 million tracks that are on there.
Yeah, I know.
It's really that makes it pretty intense, I think.
Well, so I think you can't. And a choreographer isn't necessarily the best music teacher. Like,
that's
the feedback they're giving you may be correct in their mind, but the words have the exact opposite effect on how you hear them.
Right, they may not make sense, or they may actually be the opposite language of what you would expect.
Yeah. And so, I mean, another thing I tell people who are thinking about doing music for dance is just go watch lots of dance.
Right.
I think I go to more dance concerts than music concerts. And you can see all the cliches, and you can see what works and what doesn't, and it's really important to develop your own taste and to be able to argue your taste. That's one thing I really learned from living in Europe was, man, you do a performance, and here in California, everyone comes back and says, "Oh, it's so beautiful, awesome, great." But in Europe, some guy will walk up and say, "Your piece sucked because of this, this, and this." So I was like. You have to pay attention to that. I learned very early on that whenever someone gives you feedback, even if they don't have any experience or expertise, there's something in that is useful to you.
Sure. Well, and it's also important because they actually cared enough to sort of like broach that wall and say what they had to say. Which that represents a high value in some way, I guess.
Yeah.
So after you did this for a while and you got the opportunity to hang out at your camp, it doesn't sound like you had any like super formal music education before you went there, did you?
No, I'm a definitely a failed musician, sort of education-wise, because in college I studied math and physics, and then just picked up bits of music. I mean, if learning electric bass, you learn all about harmony,
right,
jazz and stuff. And well, there's a certain earcom style that's based on. A lot of French music is based on harmonic color, and so a lot of earcom music is based on this complex extensions of traditional contemporary orchestral music.
Right. Well, so how is it that you felt comfortable, or maybe you didn't, going in there and ending up with a job? I mean, was it intimidating? I mean, for people who aren't familiar or who haven't spent time there, sort of like earchem has this sort of like daunting feel to it. Like, you know, you have to have you have to have a brain that's like coming out of your ears in order to be able to go, you know, be there. And, you know, I've been lucky enough to know a lot of people who've been, you know, involved with earchem in one way or another. But I think the general sense is that it's kind of a scary and intimidating world.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of, fortunately came in sort of the back door, and then once they accept you, it's like a community, it's a family sort of thing. I very quickly after I started working there, like maybe within 2 or 3 months, I took over the job as a musical assistant for Pierre Boulez.
Mm-hmm.
And this was this huge Max project that involved a lot of translation and stuff. And I think just reading from him was this kind of calmness, like he knows that working with computers takes forever and there are all these crashes, and he's just patient. And as long as you're really working hard and you know, not bullshitting him, he's going to respect that. Yeah, there were a lot of sleepless nights, and there's also a spirit of asking for help as, you know, part of the whole Max community.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, any day I could walk down the hall and ask Miller Puckett for advice.
Right.
And then for a while there, David Ziccarelli was in the same office, and you got Court Lippy and Zach Suttle, so they're just like all kinds of people ask for great help.
Right.
And all you do all day is work on computer music, so sooner or later you're going to get something that works.
Yeah, I guess. Well, that must have been a pretty interesting time, because that list of names you just threw out there are all really significant names in the canon of electronic music. And was there a sense at the time of something really exciting happening, or was it just so kind of heads down doing the work that you didn't think of it in those terms?
The thing about earcom is you're doing whatever project you're doing, and there are all these guests visiting it from all over the world. So basically you meet everybody who's anybody from all over the world who's coming through, and it's really exciting. I felt like I was kind of on the pulse of electronic music. So, I mean, sure, there's a lot of times where you're just staring at a screen full of numbers and screaming, but you know, there is this excitement that you're trying new things, and it was just really exciting to see to watch this weird little software Max develop into this huge thing.
If we fast forward to the present, I mean, everything we've talked about to this point has really been focused on music, but a fair amount of the work that you've been doing in the last number of years has been visuals, hasn't it?
Yeah. I guess around 2005, 2006, I kind of got bored with my own music.
Okay.
And I was getting these commissions, and I was meeting deadlines, but I thought, oh man, I'm not doing anything creative or new. It's all sounding the same. And so I just made a complete break and just started studying video. And it happened to be a great time to start. It was like right at the beginning of the HD era.
Mm-hmm. And also some pretty big price drops in the necessary tools.
That's right. Everything just became cheap and accessible and faster, and so it was really exciting. And I enjoy it a lot. I mean, it's shooting videos a lot like recording music or doing a live concert, you're capturing something you're doing. And I naturally started gravitating towards doing video for dance.
Mm-hmm.
And then combining the two. When I was making music for dance, it's really fascinating to see what happens. You have some sort of musical structure, and what will the dancers do to it?
Right.
Like this crazy connection that you can't predict.
Yeah.
With video, it's a different thing because music, you can hear it when you're not looking at it. Video, you have to look at it,
right,
and you have to look at the dance. So it's a difficult problem. A lot of times the video will become just like a piece of the scenery.
Yeah.
Or like maybe Frieder Weiss's tracking stuff becomes like costumes or something.
Right.
Or it can just be a competition and really wreck everything if you're trying to like focus on both things at once, So I've been trying to come up with video ideas that relate to the movement itself. I've done a little bit of work with dancers and sort of sensors attached to their bodies. And recently I've been trying to work with images that suggest dance that could be a score for dance.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, this is actually the current project I'm working on right now, is trying to build this anthropomorphic blob, this humanoid blob, whatever, that would be built using physics in OpenGL and projected on top of the dancer, and the dancer would use that as inspiration for improvisation or for working out choreography.
Okay.
So it wouldn't be actual gestures, but it'd be something that looks kind of like a human gesture, but you're not sure if it's an arm or a leg.
Okay.
And that gives the dancer just enough ambiguity and freedom to play with it. And I was hoping to use some of this three-dimensional data to drive the music too.
Mm-hmm.
But this is some sort of long-term project. I don't know.
Sure.
Eventually end up.
So you say that you've tried using sensors and stuff. Were you ever successful in getting something that you were happy with?
Yeah. For brief shining moments, probably the most successful piece like that was the piece I did with Jeffrey Shaw, Agnes Hedges, and Jonathan Bachrach at the Tokyo's ICC Museum, where we had this puppet model, like one of those artists' wooden models.
Right.
That was maybe 3 feet high, and it was in a immersive 3D projection space with 8-channel sound, and you'd manipulate this body in space, and it would control the visuals and the music, and I think that was a pretty cool piece. But in terms of live humans, one of the big problems is that the dancers they already have enough to do just to dance,
Right.
Like, to make these gestures and shapes in space takes up your entire brain. It really does. And to ask dancers to focus on the rhythm and stuff, or focus on musical structure, is almost asking too much.
Right.
So, I tend to work with that, with an idea that the music or video making machine that's being controlled is kind of going along on its own, and then the dancer or whatever is kind of pushing it in one direction or another. So they're not holding up the whole structure. They're just kind of steering it a little bit. You have to give them the opportunity the ability to fail and have things still move forward and so forth.
Well, and speaking of that, has there ever been anything that has just been that you've worked hard on and has been just a absolute failure?
Well, so many to choose from, really, so many to choose from. But one that comes to mind was long ago when I first started doing Max. I thought, oh wow, I'm gonna build a Max patch, and I'll give it a melody and a key, and it'll do voice leading chord progressions, harmonization.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I spent months on this thing it must have been this was back in, I don't know, Max 3 or something. It was just all these crazy structures trying to make it work. And I finally got something to work, It was like, here's an actual correctly voice-led harmonization of a melody. And I had to sit back and say, God, I could just do that on my own so much better. Just by ear, not even having any musical education at all.
Right. That's hilarious. Well, because that kind of does point to, I was going to say maybe it was worse in the past than it is now, but I think people, if anything, have a stronger belief right now in computing as being able to solve all our problems for us and make everything easier. And the fact that sometimes that's just that's such a red herring, especially when you're talking about artistic work, because it's so easy to get wrapped up in embracing the technology and using it to amplify whatever you're thinking, to the point where you just become, your thought processes then end up being just sort of an extension of the available technology.
You're just making demos.
You're just making demos. That's exactly right. And I think it's a real slippery slope.
Yeah, I mean, if we zoom out, looking at life in general, I mean, just keep in mind that all of humanity happened, all these amazing lives and art and adventures for thousands and thousands of years, all that happened without any kind of computer or even a fax machine. So you can have an incredible life without any of this technology at all.
Well, I think that this was the first time that a fax machine has ever reared its head in my podcast. So I want to thank you for that.
Okay, yeah.
No, but I agree. And it's, and especially when you're working with something like dance, where to a certain extent, even with the most modern of dance, you still really do feel kind of the primitive and visceral nature of it in comparison to anything that you can do on a computer.
Yeah, and that's one reason I keep getting drawn to actual samples of real sounds or real movement, and working with those. There's richness there that is hard to create from scratch.
Right. So where do you think, in the worlds that you interact with, which remain really kind of focused around this dance world, where do you think the near-term future is going to take us? I mean, I ask it for no other reason than I'd like to prepare myself for the next time I have to deal with dancers.
Well, stylistically, dance is in an amazing phase right now. So much of the 20th century was spent in breaking rules and coming up with new languages and then breaking those rules, and then the whole technology thing was just added onto that. It was just like one new technology after another. And we're now at a point where there's all this stuff available, and you can sit back and say, well, maybe I don't care about being on the cutting edge. How can I make my personal statement? So in particular, choreographically, you see people like, let's say, Crystal Pite from Vancouver, who is just combining ballet and pop locking and creating a very personal but extremely complex and rich style of movement. And also in terms of technology, we've already seen a lot of the low-hanging fruit, like projection mapping and tracking and so forth. So I think the really interesting thing is people who come up with really original ideas that combine high-tech and low-tech and enable the physical body to remain powerful in spite of being surrounded by a bunch of computers. How'd that sound?
That actually sounds pretty good. And at the same time, it's by categorizing almost anything that I've ever done as low-hanging fruit, I feel like I have to go back to the lab now.
Well, that's where we all start. That's the best place to start.
We all have short arms, so low-hanging fruit is the important fruit. Well, Les, I want to thank you so much for taking the time this evening to talk with me. I hope that
my pleasure, darling.
I hope that you enjoy the discussion as much as I do. Every time I talk to you, I feel like I learn new stuff. And in as much as I talk about other people being, you launching them or inspiring them to do things in sometimes very subtle and very simple ways, I find that every time I talk to you, I come away inspired and with new ideas. So I want to thank you personally for that.
Oh, you're being too kind.
Yeah, no, I'm not being even kind enough. But anyway, so I just want to thank you again for the time and for your willingness to talk about this stuff. We have had people on the podcast that have dealt with dancers, but we haven't gotten into it in as much depth. And to me, it's such a vital world right now. It's a world that is really interesting to work with. And so I appreciate you talking to us about it.
It was a pleasure, Darwin.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, and have a great evening. I'll talk to you later.
Okay.
Bye. Okay, there's podcast number 33 in the pocket. A great opportunity to get caught up with Less Stuck. I want to thank again everyone for their support and listenership. The number of subscriptions continues to grow, as does the number of people listening. If you have any questions, comments, or any other ideas, please make sure you drop me a line at ddg@cycling74.com. Otherwise, I will see you next weekend. Great. Bye.